So, my least favorite thing about doing the show is recording people's intros after recording. And I always feel like people are just better at introducing themselves. So, I'm wondering if I could, hoist, or is it hoist or foist? I'm going to say foist that task onto you.
Okay. Okay, I can do that. Yeah, I'm Daniel Shaw. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I'm a trained psychoanalyst and a trauma therapist. I work in Manhattan and also here in Rockland County where I live. Uh, I began training to do this kind of work back in 1994, right after leaving a group I'd been very much a part of for 13 years, which I came to see as a cult. So one of the first things I got interested in was traumatic abuse in cults. And that's when I began to study narcissism. So in 2014, I wrote my first book about narcissism, Traumatic Narcissism, Relational Systems of Subjugation. And this year, I published my second book, Traumatic Narcissism and Recovery, Leaving the Prison of Shame and Fear. Both books are published by Routledge for the Relational Perspective series. I trained in the era when relational psychoanalysis was just starting to really gather steam here in New York. I studied with Stephen Mitchell, Lewis Aaron, and many of the other great teachers of the relational psychoanalysis movement. And currently, my practice has been all on Zoom, like almost all of us have had our practices because of COVID-19. But I'm hoping to get back to the New York office soon. And okay, I think that might sum it up.
I think that was
Oh, and
perfect.
also, if this, I don't know if you can edit this in or whatever, I'm also on the faculty and I'm a clinical supervisor at the National Institute for the Psychotherapy. I've been teaching for many years.
All right, great. Thank you so much. And yeah, as you mentioned, your primary interest, or I don't want to place that on you as your primary interest, but the interest we're talking about today is the subject of traumatic narcissism. Um, as I understand it, narcissism is not a completely monolithic concept. There's a couple different takes within the psychoanalytic tradition of what narcissism is. Here, in the United States, there's big kind of split, if I understand right, between Kernberg and Kohut around that. Not split, but maybe tension. So I'm wondering, before we get into specifically traumatic narcissism, how do you conceptualize narcissism just as a concept?
Yeah. Well, the reason I decided to go ahead and offer my own take on what had already been a highly developed literature about pathological narcissism was that I felt that it was impossible to really discuss narcissism in as though it's located in a person and without there being a relational system involved. So I felt that narcissism could best be understood as a relational strategy of a narcissistic person in terms of how they could subjugate others as a means of supplying themselves with what they needed to assure themselves of a kind of delusion of omnipotence. So many people discussed malignant narcissists, certainly Eric Fromm, certainly Kernberg and Kohut. Um, what I wanted to really clarify was that a narcissist always needs others, always needs followers or significant others to be subjugated. that's how the narcissist maintains this delusional idea of their own superiority and perfection. It's through dominating, controlling, and exploiting others. Right. So that relational dynamic was what was important to me to try to talk more about.
Yeah. So, narcissism as a relational phenomenon, um, it's kind of it's a strategy to affirm that kind of early development narcissistic view of oneself as omnipotent, that the omnipotence of the infant type of thing. Is that right?
Well, the infant is stuck with omnipotence only because of traumatic ways of being brought up. In other words, yeah, we can talk about infantile omnipotence as something that gradually diminishes as the infant is brought into a safe relational world where there's secure attachment. But when there's insecure and disorganized attachment for a developing child because of a parent's inability to provide that safety and that security, those children are growing up with problems about letting go of their sense of omnipotence, and they can insecure, disorganized attachment creates a lot of problems for people later in life, relationally, and in terms of their own sense of security. But for some people, for a group of people, uh, the solution to that insecurity is to magnify their sense of omnipotence, to bring it to a delusional level where nothing can hurt them because they're superior and they're perfect, and it's only other people who are insecure or dependent or ashamed.
So, like, to
At
follow
least
that.
that's how they would like, that's what they would like to believe, and that's what they project. And sometimes they project it quite successfully, enough to have hundreds, thousands, even millions of followers.
So to for a moment just follow that as like a developmental narrative. Um, a baby has an idea of itself as omnipotent, kind of going back to that idea of every time it cries, it gets food. It seems to be able to control its surroundings in like a godlike way, and slowly they let go of that idea because of these kind of it going. It kind of sounds like it mirrors the Koa idea of like little disappointments show, you're not omnipotent, and there's a adaptive letting go of that. But when there's some kind of traumatic disappointment or not getting what the child needs, there's like, no, I have to hold on to this illusion of omnipotence because it's all I have. And then there's a development of interpersonal strategies to continue that relationship to this illusion of omnipotence.
Right, right. I think that yeah, that's a good way to put it. Um, the main thing for a child growing up is to feel that they can attach securely to their caregivers, right? They want to know that they are safe, and they also want to know that they are loved and that they are actually recognized, uh, not merely as an extension of the parent, but that the parent takes delight in watching them become a person.
Hmm.
And that's the ideal scenario. Most of us don't have an ideal scenario, but we might come somewhere within reach of that kind of secure feeling about ourselves that we can hold on to, given how we've been brought up. But for many, many people, they're brought up in neglect and abuse. And the particular kind of neglect and abuse that I think leads to this development of a delusion of omnipotence, or the inability to grow out of that omnipotence. The particular kind of abuse and neglect, I think, has to do with shame. I think that developing children who are exposed to belligerence and humiliation as a typical relational style from their parents, from who's bringing them up, I think those people are going to have a strong likelihood of developing defenses against shame and against humiliation and against dependency. And the traumatizing narcissist is somebody who is so humiliated and ashamed of dependency that they pretend not to depend on anyone or anything. They believe themselves to be totally self-sufficient, in other words, omnipotent.
Mm.
And in order for them to sustain that delusion of their own omnipotence, the dependency and the shame that they don't want to allow for within themselves has to be something they can control in other people. And this is why they subjugate others, so that in a way they can control shame in you rather than having to control shame in themselves. They can they can control and manipulate and exploit others, and that's what keeps them able to sustain their own delusion. So that's the relational dynamic that was important to me to try to describe and identify. Why was it important? Well, I began this work after leaving a cult. And that's what I was observing and thinking about when I left. What was going on there? What was that? What kind of abuse had I just witnessed and experienced for more than a decade? And how could I understand what was going on there? That's where it came from.
Yeah. So, and what you witnessed in that experience was someone, or perhaps some collection of people, trying to control their own shit. Well, I guess there's a mechanism there that I'd like to ask. What is it exactly about making someone else feel shame, feel subjugated, feel small, that preserve? Now that I ask it, it makes sense a little bit, like that would preserve the feeling of omnipotence because it's this control.
I have the power.
Yeah.
My power is so great that nobody can make me feel small, but I can make anybody feel small, no matter how great they are. Charismatic, traumatizing narcissists want to feel that they can have power over the most powerful people in the world. An example would be Keith Raniere, the cult leader who's in prison now because of his abuses in a group called NXIVM. There's video of Keith Raniere visiting the Dalai Lama, and you can watch that video and see Keith Raniere putting himself on the same footing as the Dalai Lama, and in some ways almost like he's wanting to offer help to the Dalai Lama. Mm-hmm. This kind of narcissist, this traumatizing narcissist, wants to believe that they have greater power, greater control, greater superiority to anybody, anywhere, and that there's nobody that they couldn't, in some way, find a way to control.
And that the interpersonal style that arises from that dynamic, it's appealing to people when they come across it.
Well, it's interesting about that, and there's a lot of different reasons why it is appealing. There's charisma, first of all. There's something very appealing in some cases with people who have this delusion of omnipotence. Something very appealing about their utter confidence, their appearance of total confidence, the lack of any insecurity, the sense that everything is under control, all within them and all around them. There's something very, impressive about that. If they are, if they're very liberated in terms of their behavior, um, if if uh, if their claim to omnipotence seems to then uh, entitle them to any kind of wild behavior, that can be very exciting. So a lot of charismatic narcissists are able to be quite wild. They can be drug users or alcoholics. They can be promiscuous. They can perform and write poetry and sing, and they can get up and dance, and crowds of people are watching, just being thrilled by how uninhibited they are. This is what happens with Donald Trump and his followers. They are thrilled by how absolutely uninhibited he is and how completely and totally confident he is in his own perfection and his own superiority. He's a worst case scenario. He's a malignant, traumatizing narcissist. I want to be clear: traumatizing narcissists exists in any kind of relationship. It could be parent-child, it could be partners, spouses, it could be siblings, it could be in a family or a small group or a community. Or so, in other words, this is not simply a cult phenomenon. It's a relational phenomenon that can adapt to any sort of structure or any sort of size of community.
So, I mean, we all meet charismatic people and, they're attractive, they pull us in. But sometimes that's got to be coming from a different place than this strategy to maintain a sense of, godliness.
Yeah, I think so. Uh, you know, um, there are a lot of artists who created great works of art. I wrote about Eugene O'Neill in this regard. Uh, their great works of art are inspiring and beautiful, and yet in their personal lives, especially in their families, what you saw was this intergenerational kind of abuse and neglect of children. This was true of O'Neill's children. There are many artists you could put in that category. There are many people um, who are narcissistic in a particular sphere, whereas they might at the same time be generous and productive and creative in public spheres. Uh, so that kind of narcissism in the private sphere is true for a lot of very impressive, charismatic people. And there's a million biographies by children of famous people that describe that kind of dynamic. The parent, the public adored, who privately was a really selfish, narcissistic kind of parent. And then there's narcissistic people who are charismatic, who are really just, not malicious, not Machiavellian, not opportunistic, who put their talents to good use and successfully create organizations or movements. So there's a spectrum of in terms of narcissism. For Kohut, it was important to develop a mature, healthy kind of narcissism. His idea was that if we were secure in our development, if our natural human tendencies to be exhibitionistic, grandiose, if those were met with, loving acceptance and understanding, that those tendencies would mature and become humor and empathy and self-esteem. That was Kohut's idea of what could happen to narcissism if it were not met with trauma. But for those people who grow up with narcissistic parents who then traumatize their children, not always, but some of those children are going to go up and continue that kind of intergenerational trauma.
What interrupts that? What prevents that pattern from repeating itself?
I probably many things. I think, first of all, innately, I observe that some people tend to skew towards the depressive, skew towards the manic. And those who skew toward the manic are likely to take on more of the narcissistic tendencies. The depressives, many of the people I work with are adult children of very traumatizing narcissistic parents. Many of those people struggle with their self-esteem and struggle with depression. They struggle to ever feel good enough. Many of them still in their hearts would love to be recognized by the narcissistic parent who actually has never really shown anything but contempt for them. Those people probably innately skew more toward the depressive. It's so there's that. There's also, of course, all the different kinds of influences people might have as they develop, whether they're teachers or friends or other people's parents, or somebody being raised by a traumatizing narcissist might actually have had the resourcefulness as a child to spend more of their time at their friend's house where the parents were really warm and loving and accepting than they spent in their own home. That those influences can make a big difference.
So you mentioned that when somebody has a traumatizing narcissistic parent, they'll kind of be continually pursuing the approval of that parent. I imagine that's not always literally the approval of the parent that gets projected onto other figures. Well, I'm trying to think about a different way to word it. If I'm trying to think of, it kind of sounds like the experience of having a traumatizing narcissistic parent does not invariably lead to the development of a traumatizing narcissistic. It could come out the child can develop a couple different ways, and one of those ways is a continued trying to get the approval of that traumatizing narcissistic parent. Children outlive their parents most of the time, or they move on to other primary relationships. So I'm wondering how that dynamic maintains past the close constant relationship between parent and child?
Right. Right. No, that's a good question. And certainly um, what the struggle for the adult child of a traumatizing narcissist really is about is uh, to, to find the authority for their own, to be able to define themselves on their own terms, and to try to release themselves from the grip of how the traumatizing narcissist parent is defining them. So, one of the most powerful ways that the traumatizing narcissist relates to the child is by telling the child who the child is, and doing that in both active and passive ways, by recognizing certain things and not recognizing other things, by and mainly through the traumatizing narcissist parent doesn't is actually highly insulted by a child's natural individuation and differentiation. This parent feels that this child's effort to become their own person is an insult to them. The narcissist parent thinks, my child should be exactly like me in every way and should conform and comply in every way to what I like and what I want. And when they start going off trying to become their own person, it's viewed as insulting. It's also, for the traumatizing narcissist parent, um, you know, they're happier with people around them who need them because they're not okay. So if my adult child isn't okay and needs me, as a narcissist parent, that gives me even if I might be critical of this adult child, um, I prefer that to an adult child who defies me, who goes ahead and becomes their own person, and who doesn't depend on my approval.
Right.
So the problem for the adult child in that situation is that as much as they go on to become their own person, as much as they fight to differentiate and individuate, it's very, very hard, even in middle age, even when you're a senior citizen. It's hard not to feel the the parent's judgment, the parent's definition of who you are, the parent's disapproval and approval, the recognition and unrecognition. There's something about the attachment bond that that seems to be one of the strongest bonds in the universe.
Yeah.
And so for the adult child of this traumatizing narcissist, many of them go on to successfully build their own lives, have good families, have meaningful professional lives, but they're never recognized that by those narcissist parents, and that often never stops hurting.
Going with, my, I want to come back to that, but before I do, my understanding of the Freud's idea of narcissism at its rawest, at its most simple, is it's a infusion or direction of energy towards self. And it sounds like, and then that would be kind of be one thread that runs through all definitions of narcissism. It sounds like the children of traumatizing narcissists, when they don't go on to adopt the same strategy, sometimes have a lack of healthy narcissism, where they're always seeing themselves through the eyes of the parent, and never kind of bring their view appropriately behind their own eyes.
Yes, this also happens in marriages. where one partner is a traumatizing narcissist. The way you've said it is I think very apt. One of the people who consults with me said that told one of her patients, "You see yourself through your mother's glasses," and I think that's another way of phrasing what you were just saying. That they have been so profoundly influenced by the narcissist parents' judgments and opinions and definitions of them that their struggle is to try. The struggle is very painful. I want to define myself, but I want to define myself in a way that you'll recognize. So but if I define myself, that automatically means that I'm not letting you define me. And they're in this kind of a turmoil. Maybe it's a double bind. If I differentiate, you reject me, you repudiate me, and if I'm dependent, you have contempt for me, and so it's like the child of this kind of narcissist really can't win. And working with them is all about trying to help them take ownership of their self-esteem, take ownership of their own self-definition, and actually recognize the strength and the goodness there that is not recognized by the narcissist parent.
What is that process, either for the individual undertaking it or for the therapeutic alliance? What is that process of taking ownership of one's own self-definition look like?
Well, it often looks like this. It often looks like a patient telling, with me, okay? With me, it looks like a patient telling me about themselves, and I start to notice ways in which they very habitually, either casually or very intensely, belittle themselves. I'm such an idiot. Yeah, of course I thought that. How stupid is that? Casual ways in which they refer to deficiencies within themselves, or intensely, God, I hate myself so much. I'm just sick of myself. I just wish I could kill this part of me. So there's this. That's the first thing that it looks like. Self-alienation is the way traumatologist Janina Fisher refers to it. And really, if you think about it, there's a self trying to go on living, and another part of the self acting as a critic, judge, condemner, another part of the self just dedicated to criticizing and condemning, harshly judging. I think of this as a part of the self, because I think of the self as multiple, as a, just as a given in terms of the way the human mind is organized, that we're organized in terms of different parts of self. And in the best of cases, those different parts of self are connected enough to each other that we feel like one whole person. Mm-hmm. In the worst case scenario, we're looking at dissociative identity disorder, where literally different parts take on different personalities within the same person. But most of the people I work with don't demonstrate parts to that extreme degree, although I do work with some cases of DID. Mostly what you see, the way I see it, is a part of the self that wants to live and try to fulfill potential. Another part of the self that is dedicated to criticism and discouragement. You can't do that. Are you kidding? You're not good enough for that. You'll never get that promotion, etc. That voice, and at least, and that is what's most obvious with people I work with who have grown up with some kind of a traumatizing narcissist parent. Not always an extremely traumatizing narcissist parent, even, but in some form or other, this self-alienation is there when they haven't felt that they had a parent who recognized and accepted them on their own terms as a person in their own right. Right? So internalizing that critic, condemning judge is the first thing that I observe, that I start to try to bring to the attention of the client. And it's often a surprise to the client how frequently, how unconsciously they're constantly belittling themselves. And so that's the first step. From there, we begin to try to listen to that critical voice more, find out more about where that's coming from. Who does that voice sound like? Somebody you know? Is that a voice in your own head that you once had outside? Usually that's pretty easy to detect for people. But many people are dedicated to the belief that they really are defective and bad. So a lot of the work initially with these people is to try to strengthen their awareness of the part of them that has kept them going. The part of them that has kept them going has managed to get them through school, has managed to get them employed, has managed to get them into a relationship. Many of the people who speak to this self-loathing so intensely have very loving relationships with partners, with their own children, are admired and appreciated at work, have excelled academically or professionally, and yet that self-loathing is so intransigent, so intractable, and that's a lot of the initial work. If I can help somebody start to appreciate that they have a lot more to them than just that struggling self and that critical, condemning judge, if I can show them that they actually are they themselves are the person that have become successful. They often can't even believe it's them that is the success. One guy was the valedictorian of his class at a prestigious school, the head of the soccer team, and universally admired and beloved. And he told me that at no time did he ever feel like he was that person. So it's developing a connection to these strong and healthy parts of the self that can then start to develop a connection to these abject, belittled parts with compassion. The key is self-compassion. The adult child of the traumatizing ultimately has to, in order to define themselves on their own terms, has to be able to have compassion and understanding for themselves and diminish the judgment and the condemnation.
And does that compassion gets directed even towards the kind of harsh and critical aspect of the self?
It's important to recognize something about that, I think. The harsh and critical aspect of the self in trauma studies has become known as a protective part. This is something you'll hear in internal family systems and in other systems that look at trauma as well. Certainly, the Jungian analyst Donald Kalshed speaks about this, that this persecuting part of the personality actually is a misplaced protective defense. What's the protection? The protection is to tell the self to lay low and give up and stay put and don't try to come out and show yourself. You're just going to get shot down. So if I can persecute myself enough to just give up and not try, I will eliminate the risk I take if I do try to stand up and live. I'll eliminate the risk of being re-traumatized. So traumatized people are always trying to figure out how, always expecting to be re-traumatized and always trying to figure out how not to be. And one of the means of trying to take traumatization into their own hands rather than allow it to happen at somebody else's hands is to put themselves down in that way. So that concept takes most people don't quite really grasp that concept until they've started to develop more compassion.
So what ultimately happens to that protector turned judge?
Right. What happens? Well, it's sort of like, there's a peace treaty. It's internal. There's a lot of energy in that kind of protection and judging that can be converted to more creative and productive energy. There's energy in, there are ways in which the intelligence, the anticipatory intelligence of these protective parts, can be made, can be used constructively. Any of the parts internally that have developed a more aggressive or belligerent quality, when it's possible to have understanding and compassion for those parts of the self, those parts can heal. They can use their energy for good. They can join the constructive aspects of the person.
Do you see that this might be too particular to the experience of the child of the traumatizing narcissist to bring out to such a universal concept, but do you see the critical, harsh part of the self as having any relationship to the superego?
Well, that would be how you would talk about it if you were following the classical Freudian model. That's not a model that I was ever that I ever took to in terms of my clinical thinking. I'm not saying that the model isn't useful, and I know for a fact that it is for many clinicians. My model was always a trauma and dissociation model, and that was the path that I got on early on in my training. So that path, has less use. The originator of that path was Pierre Janet, who Freud studied under and learned from initially early on, and certainly Ferenczi, Freud's last disciple to be banished, last great disciple to be banished, was going in that direction. Jung was going in that direction. And so I really went in that direction. And that the traumatology world is very influenced by Pierre Genet's ideas about trauma and dissociation. So it's a different model of the self. It's a model of a multiple self with more or less dissociation among parts.
People who find themselves in a situation in which they're being subjugated by a traumatizing narcissist, conventional wisdom is that that's not any specific type of person. It's somebody who is in a difficult part of their life and is particularly vulnerable at a particular moment and gets drawn in. Is that your understanding, or is there some prior or like priming relationship to a traumatic narcissist, traumatizing narcissist that might that might play in there?
Yeah, that's possible. The problem is that there's really so many different profiles of the people who become trapped in these kinds of relational dynamics with the traumatizing narcissist. There's so many different biographies with profiles. There are people. So it's difficult to draw generalized conclusions, but so one of the most generalizable conditions is that the person is at a vulnerable point in their life, some kind of a period of transition or vulnerability where they feel uncertain, where they feel a loss of security, and they need something to help them feel more clear or more confident. So that's definitely one of the common denominators, and that's why college campuses have always been recruiting places for cults, because young adults are struggling with the difference between being a child and being an adult, and that's a big long gap between the two things, that where people are insecure in various ways and vulnerable in various ways or uncertain. So there's that. I also think that very few people have become adults or young adults without experiencing some kind of trauma, some sort of traumatic experience of, from mild to severe. The thing is that not everybody who has experienced trauma and who is at a vulnerable point in their life gets into some kind of a relationship with a traumatizing narcissist. Some of those people get help from an excellent counselor or friend or community. People who get into these bad relationships with traumatizing narcissists, or bad groups led by traumatizing narcissists, they're just like everybody else, except they're not getting the help they need anywhere else. And the first time they feel that they could get help is from a traumatizing narcissist who is very good at extending love and compassion and understanding in a charismatic way. So if that's their misfortune to encounter that kind of help rather than some other kind, that often accounts for how they got involved.
Should people be wary of charismatic figures in general?
I think so. I would. I am. I am. It's not to say that there aren't many honorable, decent, honest, and very constructive people with charisma. that is true. Um, but nobody's perfect, and the more a person accumulates power, the more vulnerable they are to the corruption of power, and that's just an old adage everybody knows, but it's true. And I think some people are brilliant at maintaining their humanity and their humility while achieving renown or success, and but many people find that pretty challenging. Uh, I also think the problem with idol worship is that, you know, um, it said somewhere a long time ago, don't worship false idols. I believe that's the Old Testament. Um, Human beings are very, it doesn't make a lot of sense to idolize a human being because they're a human being.
Mm.
And human beings are by nature imperfect and by nature never, it's simply not possible for there to be a perfect human being. Many of the people in the new age and wellness and yoga world who are influencers is the term now, used to be gurus or still is gurus. Many of these people are idolized by followers.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not only are they just as human as anybody else, but many of them who allow themselves to be idolized are keeping some pretty dark secrets about who they're exploiting and who they're abusing. So, yeah, I would beware. I would be cautious around charismatic people. And if you think you're a charismatic person, uh, try to stay humble. Try to figure out who you need to talk to and be around that can help you stay keep your balance, keep your perspective.
Yeah, with that in mind, it's hard not to draw the conclusion that the way we're kind of organized largely as a species right now at this point in history might be empowering to traumatizing narcissists, and that might hierarchy might be set up in such a way where the higher up you go, the more often you see that personality style. Um,
I think also we have to acknowledge the ubiquitous presence of social media, and this has been a tremendous magnifier and a megaphone for people who want to achieve that kind of power. And, people who are normally not going to be exposed to those kinds of influences in their own communities are exposed to them on their screens. Uh, to a level which has never been seen before uh, in the history of the human race. So I think that has that's what we're seeing right now. And I finally decided to put my crisis on the website because for more than a year, starting uh, not last August, but the August before, for more than a year, I was getting 2 or 3 calls a day from people terrified who either had just left some kind of a cult or who had a family member deeply involved in one of the online cults like QAnon.
mm-hmm.
I have never received that many calls from that many people over 25 years. Maybe I'll work with at most a dozen a year, people who have some concern about ex-cult trauma. Uh, this was extraordinary. And these calls have diminished because I decided people needed to know that I have to get paid for the work I do. I can't, most of the people were calling for in dire need of assistance through insurance or Medicare, which I can't provide. So the calls stopped coming once I made that clear on my website. And unfortunately, I have a network of colleagues who are specifically dedicated to working in the ex-cult space. Not all of them are mental health professionals. Some of them are educators and coaches, but all of them, the ones I know, are very experienced. And those are the people I can refer to who are able to take on more cases or different parts of the country and so on. But really, the internet, the availability of information on the internet has incredibly increased the degree to which people are falling prey to predatory, traumatizing narcissists of one kind or another.
Would you say, this is a leading question, but would you say that cult activity in the United States has gone up over the past couple of years?
I don't think there's any question, and that's anecdotal because I don't do hard research in that area, but certainly the dozen or so colleagues I'm regularly in touch with who do work exclusively in that space are describing, more inquiries than ever before.
Mm-hmm. It does seem like, there's even maybe a tier under it where it doesn't reach the level of this kind of cultish indoctrination, where I'll see on YouTube, online, there just seems to be this demand and also supply for specific directions on how to live certain domains of one's life. Do this. This is how you should approach relationships or work, or.
Oh yeah, the self-help industry has never been more booming, and there's a million podcasts and a million books and a million websites. There's a million websites about narcissism. How do you divorce a narcissism? How do you know somebody's a narcissist? How do you know you're with a narcissist? How do you protect your children from a narcissist? There are just millions of these websites, web pages, books, podcasts, and so on. And it's something that people are more aware of than ever, I think, and more concerned with. And that's below the level of cults. Well, I would say that this has always been a phenomenon in our human community. It's just that we have access to more information than ever before in history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The narcissists, the traumatizing narcissists, what they offer is that there's a way to do things. Yeah. I kind of tend to think there is no specific way to live one's life. Is
Well,
that?
I think the thing about a lot of self-help groups or leaders or teachers who do become abusive is that what they're telling you is what a good therapist might say. You're alienated from yourself. You need to learn to love yourself in a compassionate way. You can say those things, but typically what goes wrong if this situation is being guided by a traumatizing narcissist is that the traumatizing narcissist doesn't really want you to achieve that, because that means that you don't need him anymore.
Mm-hmm.
If he gives you that freedom from self denigration and self loathing, and you have compassion for the self, and you're strong, then you don't need him. And the thing is, he needs you. The traumatizing narcissist needs and depends on people he can control and subjugate.
Mm.
This is one of the things I try to help people who've been in these relationships understand, because they're enthralled to somebody who it feels like they needed desperately. What they don't see is that the narcissist needed them even more desperately. The narcissist can't maintain their delusion of omnipotence unless he has people who desperately need him.
Mm-hmm.
So to understand that, in fact, this narcissist can't even hold himself together unless he's controlling people who are made to feel insecure and dependent and ashamed. The narcissist does very specific things. He or she intimidates, belittles, and humiliates. Those three very specific things are how a narcissist relates to others. Those are the means by which the narcissist wants to gain control and have you become dependent on him. Because, if he can convince you that you are afraid and needy and ashamed of yourself, and he can convince you that you need him to help you.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important to, in my work, when people have been in these relationships, to really try to extract these dynamics, pull the curtain aside and see that the narcissist, whom they thought was so powerful, is in fact an extremely disturbed and dependent person
Mm.
who actually can't maintain their grandiosity unless they get you to feel ashamed and small and weak.
If we, if we were to, I mean, the narcissist is the traumatizing narcissist is just, it's a little tricky to address this like this because well, the traumatizing narcissist is also a person suffering and suffering from a deficit in their own ability to navigate their internal and external world. And sometimes, I know that traditionally they don't seek treatment, but my understanding is sometimes circumstances are such that they do. Either they're mandated to or they're brought low in some way that really makes them reconsider things. What hope for them is there?
Uh, there's hope for them if they are scared enough to recognize that they may be failing to accomplish what they want.
Mm.
Um, but as long as they can, in fact, have the kind of control and power that they need, it's unlikely that they will ever want to acknowledge that they would need some kind of help. Um, some of the people we're talking about have gotten very far along on the path of uh, sociopathy and Machiavellianism. So those people are especially unlikely to seek help or be willing to acknowledge that they want or need help. So there are people who are less further along the spectrum who, and I've worked with some who eventually recognized that not being empathetic towards others was not who they wanted to be.
Mm.
Eventually recognized that they did not want to be contemptuous of everyone, and those people worked pretty hard to try to get to a different place. But I don't think that people who have gone too far down that line are likely to seek the help they need.
The successful traumatizing narcissist who can continually maintain the illusion of omnipotence, are they happy? Are they unhappy? Or
Oh, well, they're never going to say that they're unhappy. But the truth is, they're usually quite angry, and they have a sadistic side. So they actually enjoy the suffering of others. These are people further down the line on the spectrum, but they're I wouldn't call what their satisfaction with themselves, their upholding of this uh, delusion of omnipotence doesn't strike most of us as happiness. I don't think anybody looked at Stalin or Hitler or Mao and thought, oh, there's a happy guy.
yeah,
How they would describe themselves, it'd be something different. But if you're busy, murdering and slaughtering millions of people, I don't know that you can call that a happy person, right? I'm talking about the most malignant of narcissists there, but you take that down a notch, and I think they're often obsessed with trying to constantly remind themselves of their power and their control, and so having that power and control, they can portray themselves as very self-satisfied. But whether we want to call that happiness, I don't know. I don't really call it happiness.
if in the rare instances in which they do want to, reform or just change, I imagine the task is letting go of omnipotence, which sounds like if it's all you've known for your whole life would be terrifying.
Yeah. I think people who are able to do that will definitely have to face uh, very humiliating feelings of insecurity. And if they can bear that, if they can bear their vulnerability and their insecurity without finding it so profoundly humiliating that they have to deny it altogether, then if they can tolerate that and stay with it and work through it, they can get to the other side.
On a daily basis, the depressive child of the traumatizing narcissist deals with internal experiences that would be unbearable for the traumatizing narcissist. That feeling of that explicit thought and feeling of deficiency or defectiveness.
Yes, exactly. Which is why I try to describe an actual relational dynamic in which the traumatizing narcissist uses the other as a host for their disavowed sense of deficiency and shame and dependency. Uh, And I think that's an important way to understand that the narcissist acts in that way as a kind of parasite or vampire or zombie. All of these metaphors work. They themselves are only really alive if they feel that they've been able to gain total control over another.
Mm.
And so, to see the other struggling, uh, so if the other is trying to differentiate and not letting themselves be controlled, um, the narcissist says, "I told you so." You try to escape my control and see what happens.
Mm.
If the narcissist has these people around to control, uh, they they do not have to contend with what is internally their own emptiness, their own sense of fear, deficiency, shame. They have that. They have the other in which to control all of that, and that's the point I try to make. You know, to think of a narcissist as powerful. Most people who have been traumatized by this kind of narcissist feel they've been overwhelmed, overpowered, overtaken. Somebody much stronger than they is doing this to them. I try to help people see that the narcissist is not strong.
Mm.
The narcissist is terrified of the breakthrough of their own profoundly disorganized, frightened, shameful parts. And sometimes that can help people recover when they've been seriously traumatized.
What do you think about the ubiquity of the word narcissism? That's starting to pop up a lot.
Yeah, everywhere. It's fine. I think I think some people are getting the wrong idea. Some people are getting the right idea. There's all kinds of ideas. It's possible for everybody to think about this and talk about this and try to make sense of it. I have a specific way that I've tried to talk about it as a relational system rather than just as something a person is or has. And, a lot of people are talking about that in different language. But it's, you know, it's it's a free market situation, and wherever people find help or guidance, or you know, it can come from all kinds of different sources, and not
Yeah,
just the mental health profession. We don't own this particular issue.
sure. Yeah, I my only like concern about it is it seems like it's taken the place that maybe like 7 or 8 years ago Sociopath had, or you'd see that pop up all over pop culture, where it ends up just being a way to talk about scary monsters or to kind of or used inappropriately in like social critique, or a lot of like, oh, this is just people. A lot of times people misusing lash, um, things like that.
There's no question of that. I guess I guess I just keep my nose to the grindstone and try to provide useful information to the people I work with in the books that I've written. And,
Yeah.
you know, uh, uh, my first book, I was surprised to find was being widely read outside of the mental health profession.
Mm.
And, I've gotten a lot of feedback from people that this was very useful for them to understand uh, the dynamics that I tried to spell out. And certainly, I've experienced a lot of fulfillment in the work I do with clients, who also um, I feel do excellent work in terms of their own recovery from trauma. So, so you know, I don't. Long ago, when the internet first started getting really popular, and there were a lot of chat rooms about things, you could get into a lot of battles and debates with people. And I was the facilitator of an online colloquium for the International Association for Relational Psychoanalysis for a while. And you could get into a lot of debates and a lot of arguments and a lot of back and forth. And, so I long ago sort of developed a distaste for that much argumentation around who owns this word,
Yeah.
and I try to stay out of it.
Kind of, it is what it is. If that word stops meaning something in public imagination, I'll use a different word to talk about what I'm talking about, type of thing.
Well, I think it's up to people who want to try to explain, who feel they have something valuable to offer, to try to explain it as best they can,
Yeah.
and to be as specific as possible. And it's just that it's a huge topic, and there's lots of people wanting to talk about it, and um, I think people have a right to talk about it. So I don't. I've read some of the self-help books and self-help websites, and I don't agree with everything there, but there are people, and there are people getting the wrong idea and going too far, or getting too diluted or too distorted a sense of uh, what the subject really means. But that's unavoidable. I just think that those of us who want to talk about this need to try to be as clear as we can, and try to put information out that we have that I have a lot of clinical work behind what I try to express in writing, and I have a lot of life experience behind it, um, a lot of study behind it. I just try to make it as reliable as I can.
And it sounds like you see a little bit of a positive side to it. Of sometimes people are coming across this general material, or not always the most accurate, and they're recognizing like, oh, I'm in a bad situation with someone.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The worst case scenario of what goes on here, that I have noticed and been aware of, is that um, some influencer, whether it's a therapist, educator, or a coach, or whatever, or guru, starts to convince everybody that comes to them that they have to sever their ties to all their relationships. And that's been the one, and I've been seeing that for many years, actually, and that is the most damaging way in which misinformation about this gets out. So that these leaders, influencers, therapists, sometimes they actually are the narcissistic ones, but they persuade all of their followers that everybody in their life is a narcissist. Your husband, your
Yeah.
child, your mother, and people have taken the advice of some of these gurus to completely cut themselves off from all their attachments and only be attached to the guru. That's the biggest red flag there is. Any healer, therapist, coach, teacher, anybody who isolates you in that way and only approves of your attachment to them and disapproves of all your other attachments, that's a big red flag.
Yeah. Yeah. So the traumatizing narcissistic co-option and use of the concept of,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
There is that I've been aware of that, observing that, talking to people about that. Since I started looking at this subject.
We have just a few minutes left, and I'm wondering if there's anything that you'd like listeners or viewers to take away, or that we haven't gotten into that feels important.
The first thing that comes to mind when you ask that is that I wish we as a human race, a society, a culture, I wish that we understood better how important parenting is, how much we can encourage the growth of secure people, the growth of people who feel compassion and empathy because they have their own sense of security. I wish that this were something we could teach in a more effective way at an earlier stage. When people are becoming kids, when they're raising children, the the power and the importance of empathy and compassion just seems to me to be undervalued or underrepresented in the kinds of influences that we all are exposed to. And I won't say that's entirely true. My kids grew up in a school here where I live in Nyack, where there was a tremendous emphasis on inclusiveness and on kindness and respect, and I that was evident in the school and among the kids, and and then the kids that don't buy into that are kids who are being abused or neglected at home. So growing up in an environment that promotes the idea of mutual respect, empathy, compassion, I would love to see that effort made to a greater extent in our communities, because I think that's key. People become narcissistic and abusive because ultimately it's because they're afraid, they're envious, they're afraid that they don't have enough power, they're afraid they don't have enough control, and they feel ashamed of their vulnerability. Empathy and compassion are really the things that keep us from going down those kind of dark rabbit holes.
And if we could build that into the way children are raised, not just by their parents, but by
in our schools, in our communities. Yeah.
Well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, so I guess I'll just ask about your recent work, how people can access it, and anything else you'd like people to know.
Well, thanks. I have a website, danielshawlcsw.com. And I have a professional Facebook page, Daniel Shaw LCSW. So I'm when I do a podcast or I give talks or lectures or classes, I announce those things there. My new book is out. Routledge publishes it. Amazon is selling it. Routledge had a little mistake in the printing, which they're correcting, so it'll be selling on their website soon. Meanwhile, Amazon has the version with the slightly incorrect problem, but it's still available there. The new book is Traumatic Narcissism and Recovery: Leaving the Prison of Shame and Fear. And I think that's about it.
All right, great. I'm going to put all that information in the episode description.
Thank you. Thank you.
Daniel, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a great talk.
I appreciate your invitation so much. It's been good talking with you. Have a good one.
Hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, please like and subscribe. And if you're listening on a podcast app, please leave a rating. It helps a lot. Thanks.